when was the whole lobotomy thing?
No, what? She's not going to steal the money. I'm not sure what happened there. And
the way that Tippie Hedren.
Yeah, wow.
Which I don't believe is legal, but that's what happened. Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. Today again, I'm joined by my dad, Matt. Say hello.
Hello everyone.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about some Alfred Hitchcock movies, namely Psycho, The Birds, and Frenzy. So I'm going to start by giving a description of each movie, and then I'm going to talk about some fun facts, and then we'll get into our thoughts about each of the movies, and I'm going to ask my dad some questions. So we are going to go chronologically, and I'm going to start with Psycho, which is from 1960. Phoenix secretary Marion Crane on the lam after stealing $40,000 from her employer in order to run away from her boyfriend, Sam Loomis, is overcome by exhaustion during a heavy rainstorm. Traveling on the back roads to avoid the police, she stops for the night at the Ramshackle Bates Motel and meets the polite but highly strung proprietor Norman Bates, a young man with an interest in taxidermy and a difficult relationship with his mother. This film was fully financed by Hitchcock and he waived his director's fee, but he owned 60% of the film's royalties. Paramount really lost out in the long run because they didn't believe in the script, and so Hitchcock took it upon himself to finance it, and then it ended up being basically his most successful movie ever. Oh, this is a really random fact, but this is the first ever American movie to show a toilet on screen. But you didn't know that. Hitchcock also loved the score written by Bernard Herrmann so much that he doubled his salary on the spot after hearing it, claiming that 33% of the effectiveness of Psycho was due to the music. And then lastly, as I'm sure most people are aware by now, but in the infamous shower scene, the blood is actually chocolate syrup, so most people actually know that. But now I want to get into our thoughts, and I'm gonna let you open up with it because I've been talking for so long.
Well, this was a Hitchcock movie that I had never seen before, amazingly enough. The shower scene is a famous scene, very cutting edge for 1960, very tame by today's standards, but I knew about that particular scene because it was so famous. I probably saw bits and pieces of this movie over the years on television, but I never sat down to watch it. It was nothing like I expected. It kept my attention. I agree that the soundtrack was a big add to this. I was surprised how it started. This woman decides to take this money she was going to take to the bank for her boss and then run with it. You just wonder where's this going to go, and end up with Norman Bates at the Bates Motel and the shower scene and all of that.
I actually thought that we were going to be starting at the Bates Motel a little bit earlier. I was very surprised when Marion Crane was killed off so suddenly, because having grown up hearing about this movie, I always assumed that that might have been part of the climax. It seemed like a really climactic moment, and she was also the main character for the first half of the movie, roughly, first 40 minutes. So that took me by surprise. I'm also shocked that as fans of Alfred Hitchcock, we had never watched this movie in full before, but we've never owned it or anything like that. How did you feel about Anthony Perkins? Because this is obviously a rather iconic role with Norman Bates, so I want to open it up to you and ask you if you feel that this is another one of those roles that probably couldn't have been filled by another actor, or if you feel differently.
I think he was a highlight of the movie, along with Hitchcock's favorite music. He was already a well-known actor, which I didn't know, but the part that he played was very unique, and not just anybody could have played that part. He was the critical actor for that film, no doubt about it. And I would say it is hard for me to think of another actor that could have played that part. I'm sure I could come up with one, but it's a unique one, and he was just the right person for it.
I loved him in this role as well.
I'll tell you another reason that I enjoyed watching this movie. For someone of my age group, to see shots of Phoenix, Arizona, where this movie starts. She takes a road trip into California. See a lot of road footage, what the cities looked like at that time period. This is a black and white movie. I enjoyed that part of it. It was interesting to see how different the cities looked at that time. And then as she came into California and was driving up north to what I imagine is probably the San Joaquin Valley today is where the town was. It was interesting to see that part.
This movie is rather old at this point, so I think it's safe to get into some spoilers, also because it's such a famous pop cultural movie, I think it's okay. So I want to talk about the ending. I had sort of had this movie spoiled a little bit just from everything that I've seen over the years about it, but I didn't quite know the ending. I want to know if you thought that it was surprising or if it had been spoiled for you previously.
No, the ironic part about this is that I was born in 1959 when this, a year before this movie came out. My dad's a movie guy and I've seen bits and pieces probably, but I had no idea where this movie really went. I knew about the shower scene, and I knew for anybody that's been in the Universal Studios tour over all the years, when you go on the Black Lot tour, they go by the Bates Motel and they have a guy run and shove a body in a car. So I knew those things, but I had no idea about anything about the movie. That made it more fun because I had no idea how that movie was going to finish, particularly as you mentioned earlier. I thought that the shower scene was going to be like the penultimate scene near the end,
right.
And it's just part of it. You're a long way away from the ending of that movie when that particular scene happens.
It's hard for me to say that I was surprised by the ending, although I was slightly biased having known that there was going to be some sort of twist at the end. However, I didn't feel like it came too far out of left field because the entire movie, they never showed his mother's face. She was always really far away, and even when he was carrying her down the stairs, you never saw her face, you never saw her speak or anything. So I thought, okay, well, obviously something is fishy with his mom. There were just so many inconsistencies, and obviously that's foreshadowing and you're supposed to be suspicious and whatnot. I couldn't help but realize fairly early on what the twist was gonna be because I knew that there was no way that she could possibly be alive, and I just sort of assumed that Norman had some sort of mental issue with him doing the voices of both him and his mother. I don't feel like it was terribly accurate, but of course they didn't know too much about mental illness back in the 60s. You were alive for this. When was the whole lobotomy thing happening?
Oh, I think that was more
70s?
in the 50s and 60s probably.
Okay, yeah, so
Yeah.
exactly around that time period. They didn't know a ton about mental illnesses, and so it felt very obvious to me. I don't know, that might be different just because I've grown up in a generation with a better understanding of the psyche. I don't know.
It surprised me. I was surprised.
I liked the ending. I basically suspected that his mom was dead, but what I didn't expect was him to come running in with his wig on and all of that. I thought he would just fess up to it, but then they said that it had something to do with him having multiple personalities and taking on the personality of his mother, which I didn't expect. So
that was the other thing that was cutting edge about the movie: the toilet, the shower scene, and also him playing multiple personalities, including his mother. Those were all radical things in 1960 in movies. Most of y'all that are watching this, that's nothing, but in a movie like that in 1960, and I'm guessing that's probably why he had to bankroll this movie. He may not have gotten a studio to be willing to put the money up because they were radical things for 1960.
Absolutely. Not to mention you had a male actor who was dressing up as a woman, and transgendered people were not respected whatsoever back then. I think that they handled it pretty well in the movie. They used the term transvestite, which I don't know if that's politically correct anymore, but the way that they explained it, it didn't seem horribly offensive, but coming from a non-transgender person, I can't say that for sure, but it seemed like they handled that pretty well with explaining it with his multiple personality disorder.
I think for 1960 they did a good job.
For 1960s,
They really did.
Yeah.
I was surprised by the scene where they start talking about it, actually, and they had a psychiatrist there with the police, and they're talking about all this, and they were pretty matter-of-fact about it, so they didn't act like it was some freak show, which I would have thought maybe at that time period, 60 years ago, 59 years ago, they might have, but they didn't. There was not much lightheartedness in this movie from the beginning until the end. I mean, there was some at the very beginning of the movie when the guy's going to buy the building and gives him $40,000 in cash, and they're drinking. There's a little bit, but most of the rest of the movie, there aren't many smiles in the rest of that movie. It's pretty serious.
No, but now that you mentioned the beginning of the movie and you're talking about the man that is buying the property and whatnot, he is very brazen and open with being uncomfortably sexual towards Marion and whatnot. So I can understand her frustrations with that. I can understand why she would want to take the money from him in particular, but maybe I just missed something. Maybe you could shed some light on her motivations for me, because I wasn't entirely sure why she ran away.
Yeah, she was frustrated frustrated because she was having these forays at the hotel with the guy that was in the middle of getting a divorce.
Right.
Or had just, no, he'd just gotten a divorce. And they were meeting in Phoenix because he ran a hardware store. For some reason, he would come to Phoenix, he would see her, they would have tryst in a hotel. And then he kept telling her that he would marry her, but he had to get things taken care of back home. And she was so frustrated that particular day. She's not feeling really great about herself at that moment, that here she is with this guy in a hotel room and all of this during her lunch break. He needed the money to finish off buying out, I think, the hardware store that was probably his dad's. Talked about money. She wanted to be married to this guy. She was so in love. She goes back to work, and then all of a sudden, her boss tells her to take this money straight to the bank and put it in a safe deposit box, because in 1960, $40,000 was probably $250,000 today or something like that. It just clicked. Little facial expression you see at one point, and you wonder what she's thinking exactly, and you still wonder for a while what she's really going to do. You're thinking, no, she's not going to steal the money, but she saw the money as her savior, I think. She was going to go to this town in California and give him the money so he could buy out the hardware store, so he could get married. They'd live happily ever after, and that was what drove her to do this crazy thing.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
I'm also curious your thoughts on the scene where she's swapping out her car and the police officer is just watching her from across the road, and then he comes over. There's no confrontation. There's just this really awkward energy exchange between her and this police officer and this salesman who kind of can tell that something is going on, and she's being super obvious about it, and the police officer is just super obviously watching her. I thought that scene was really awkward, and I didn't totally understand it. What were your thoughts on that?
I'm not a Hitchcock expert. I have only seen a few Hitchcock movies. I'm going to delve into them now. I'm going to try to see all of them. It's a goal that I have now. I'm guessing that somebody will give you a comment on your channel, that was maybe just kind of a Hitchcock effect, like in the middle of, not the middle, but in the first third of the movie, you could have had a 7-minute mini film about that.
Suspense?
Yeah, because you didn't know what the heck was going on. I said to you, why is the guy keeping his sunglasses on? Why is he watching her? Why did he follow her into town? I'm guessing that is something Alfred Hitchcock would do. Somebody will have to tell us, correct us.
Yeah, someone feel free to elaborate down below. So I'm a fan of murder mystery, kind of whodunit type of a thing, and in this one we do see the killer and it's pretty evident from the beginning. However, in the end they do the whole explanation where the one detective or officer kind of explains the whole story and explains Norman's psyche and whatnot, and I thought that mirrored Knives Out really well, because that was a very classic whodunit, but that got released last year in 2019, and I love that movie. However, I know that some people don't like those, or they just don't like the fact that sometimes movies will spoon feed people the answers. I felt it was necessary in this movie, but what did you think about that? How do you feel about being spoon fed in movies? Do you prefer to think about things and come to your own conclusion, or how do you feel about that?
I'm kind of in the middle of the road on that one. It's fun sometimes just to still be looking at the other person you're watching it with and saying, I'm not sure what happened there, and do you know what so-and-so did? But I also do like it in Knives Out, which you and I saw together, that kind of a movie, a Agatha Christie style of whodunit, where they brought it all together, because I wasn't sure what was happening. They wrapped it up in a nice bow to understand what had been going on, and I appreciated it in that particular instance. I wouldn't want that in every suspense movie and every horror movie to have it tied up in a bow, but it was good in that particular circumstance. I think they might have needed to do it in 1960. They maybe
probably
needed to give a little more detail, where we're more educated today. We know a lot more than we knew back then about a lot of things. The world's a lot different, obviously. Maybe back then Alfred Hitchcock felt like it would be better to tie it up.
I actually, now that we're talking about it, I'm thinking about it more. I feel like this movie was ahead of its time in the way that it explained things, especially because we talked about the fact that Norman Bates was dressing like a woman. I feel like if there was a similar case on a true crime show or something, they would have had to explain that as well, because it's hard to come up with an explanation on your own as to why this man keeps his mother's skeleton and dresses up like her to kill people. I don't think that would ever be super obvious to anybody even now, so I felt like that movie was ahead of its time, and in the way that it explained it, I was a fan of.
I was too. I enjoyed the movie.
I did too. I think it's certainly rewatchable, obviously. I also love the opening credits. I thought that for the 60s, they were super ahead of their time as well. They looked very modern, as well as the cinematography. At times, it was a little bit shaky and almost felt found footagey. I felt almost like someone that shouldn't be watching these people. I felt very much like an outsider, which I guess would be true for most movies, but there was something about this movie that it just was so eerie. I felt like I shouldn't be watching these people and their interactions and stuff like that. That pretty much does it for my questions and my thoughts on Psycho. Unless you want to wrap it up, we can move on.
I think I've said my piece.
All right, then we will move on to The Birds. So The Birds came out in 1963, just 3 years later, and The Birds received a 96% on Rotten Tomatoes. Melanie Daniels meets Mitch Brenner in a San Francisco pet store and decides to follow him home. She brings with her the gift of 2 lovebirds and they strike up a romance. One day, birds start attacking children at Mitch's sister's party. A huge assault starts on the town by attacking birds. Kind of a weird synopsis. Okay, so before I get into the fun facts and everything, do you want to just kind of talk about our background with this movie? This was the first Alfred Hitchcock movie that I ever saw, besides Rear Window maybe? I'm pretty sure this was the first one because we've owned this movie as long as I've been alive, and I rewatched it several times because it was one of the only movies that I could watch that was frightening, that didn't give me nightmares because I wasn't afraid of birds or anything. So this was one of my favorite movies when I was a kid, actually. But do you want to talk about your background with this movie?
It's the first Hitchcock movie that I saw. I saw it as a kid. I probably have seen it numerous times as a kid on TV. It's one of the most unforgettable movies of my childhood, one that my parents did let me watch. It scared me, and the concept of it still scares me whenever I see a gathering of birds together. This is a movie that's popular in our family. I remember sharing it with Kylie for the first time and her sister Tara, who's older. I remember watching it with my parents. We've watched it as a family since then, and then we watched it to do this, and it was kind of fun to watch it from that angle because I looked at a lot of different things that I wouldn't have paid attention to necessarily. It's a great movie.
It is, although it has been critically analyzed from the standpoint of the way that Tippie Hedren, the way that Tippie Hedren was treated on set, similar to the way that the character's storyline ended up. And I'll explain it a little bit. I still love this movie, but there are some things that wouldn't fly today.
It's been dissected, and today, like people do dissect movies and lots of different things in culture, and there are some things that you ran across during that dissection.
Yes, okay, thank you for that. I didn't know how to explain that quite.
Yeah.
So with Melanie Daniels' character, she's from a very wealthy family. She does whatever she pleases. She's kind of a joker. She's very free-spirited. She's very whimsical and spontaneous. She just drives up to Bodega Bay to surprise this man that she just met the other day. She does whatever she wants, and then ultimately in the end, her character was severely punished, and literally in real life, Tippie Hedren, why can't I talk today? Tippie Hedren was punished as well, and I want to talk about that. It has to do with the final scene where she goes up into the attic and she's attacked by all the birds.
Yeah.
I have some not so fun facts about that scene. They were supposed to have mechanical birds, and that's what Tippie Hedren signed up for. And on the day of filming, I believe it was her manager or one of the set managers came in, and they informed her that in fact the mechanical birds were not working, so they brought in a trainer with real birds to be thrown at her. And they took 5 days to film this scene. And by the end, Tippie said that she was hardly conscious. She dissociated so badly. She was really unaware of what was going on. She did an interview with Vogue, and this was pretty recent. This was a few years ago, and I'm gonna quote her here. She said, "Then I put on my dress and she pulled the elastic through the tears in it. I lay down on the set in front of the door and stayed very still while I loosely tied the feet of a few of the trained birds to the elastic. By then I was barely coherent, not sure how much more of this I could possibly take. Action, again, and I was pelted with still more live, screaming, frantic birds, while the birds that were tied to me began pecking me as they'd been trained to do. She goes on to explain the rest of the story, and I'll link that down below so you can read up on it as well. But essentially, Tippie had a really bad relationship with Hitchcock from that point. I lost a little bit of respect for Hitchcock, even though I love this movie and I love Psycho. Hearing that really put me off, and just the fact that he would put one of his actresses through this, but she was very resilient and I commend her for sticking to it. Obviously she was contracted to finish the movie, but she stuck it out for 5 whole days until she yelled that she'd had enough. And so now that I've unloaded all of that onto you,
Yeah, wow.
what are your thoughts on that?
Well, obviously, I was sorry to hear that this was as traumatic of a situation as it evidently was. You know, it's another one of those things, like so many things in the world today, that some people found it acceptable back then, and now we listen to it and we don't know what to even say about something like that. That scene is scary enough. I remember seeing that scene when I saw that movie in the 1960s as a kid. I can't imagine having to go through multiple takes over 5 days with real birds when I had expected that it was going to be some kind of mechanical birds. It kind of reminds me of the story of Jaws and how they had so much problems with the actual mechanical Jaws movie. And they had a shark, and had to work around that. So without going behind the curtain, so to speak, that movie I think is just one of the best horror films, suspense films, whatever you want to call it. It just stands up over time. Whenever I see a whole bunch of birds on a telephone line, even to this day, I often think of the movie Birds, and golly, thought that I was kidding when I said that the other day, but I wasn't. I mean, that movie really stuck with me when I saw that movie the first time. It really stuck with me. Thinking of thousands of birds wanting to peck at you and injure you is an overwhelming concept.
Yeah, I want to rein it back to that scene that I was talking about though, because I actually read this interview before we rewatched the movie, and previously I hadn't watched the movie for at least 5 years or so. It's been a long time since I'd rewatched it, and I read the interview beforehand, and then watching the scene gave me this whole new perspective and made it so much more horrific, because generally when you're watching a horror movie, you know that it's not real, but for Tippi Hedren it was very much real, not just for her character. For Tippie, it was very real. And so I was kind of more looking for your thoughts on that, and kind of the morality behind putting your actors through stuff like that. I know that a lot of stunts people go through crazier things every day, but I was just wondering your thoughts more on that.
Well, I can only imagine the stories that people would have about what they put people through to be in movies over the 20th century. Things that today we wouldn't even consider. Some of which they may have known going in, and then some, such as a situation like this, something happens that changes the way things are going to be done, or, you know, maybe somebody just isn't honest when they're recruiting somebody for a film. I'm sure that there are many bad stories about that in the old days, so to speak. I can't see that happening today.
No, I remember I was watching one of the documentary series on Shudder about just the history of horror, and I can't remember the name of the movie. It's the Stephen King movie with the evil car. No. It was Cujo. The actress in Cujo, it took them roughly 3 weeks, I believe, to film the scene in the car when the dog is attacking her in the car, and she actually suffered from a heat stroke or heat exhaustion. And so there's tons of stories of movies back in the day where stuff like this would happen, and fortunately now you can generally provide better conditions, but filming movies is grueling and not glamorous work. You work for 12 to 16 hours a day. Back then they worked 10-hour days, so now it's even worse. It's even more grueling, and movie magic is it's not very magical, I'm sorry to tell you. Yeah, maybe that's a topic for another video. Just horror stories from horror sets maybe would be interesting, but I don't have any further questions for you for The Birds. So is there anything else that you wanted to bring up?
No, I just think that it's a classic.
It is. I'll still rewatch it. I mean, obviously it's hard to continue to support Hitchcock in light of knowing some of the things that I've learned upon doing my research for this particular video, but he's dead now, so it's not like any of our money is going into his pocket or anything. So, alright, so we're gonna move on to Frenzy, which came out in 1972, and Frenzy received a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, and apparently this was considered his penultimate film in the final phase of his films, the last leg of his filmmaking. That's considered his penultimate film. London is held in the grip of a serial killer whose modus operandi is to murder his victims by strangling them with a necktie. When short-tempered ex-Royal Air Force officer Richard Blaney discovers his ex-wife wife murdered. Blaney becomes a suspect. Forced to go on the run, Blaney attempts to take refuge with his best friend, fruit merchant Bob Rusk. However, Rusk may, in fact, be the necktie murderer himself. So I have some interesting facts about this movie that I'm going to kick off with, and then I'll let you get into your thoughts. So Alfred Hitchcock's own daughter actually found this movie to be so disturbing that she never let her children watch it, and it was basically up to them when they were grown to decide if they wanted to watch it or not, but she didn't allow it. The role of Rusk was actually offered to Michael Caine, but he was so disturbed when he read the role and read the script that he wanted nothing to do with it. And Alfred Hitchcock, as I've learned, was actually a bit of a drama king, and he was supposed to be shooting in Covent Garden in London from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and at 6:15 on one day of shooting, a union representative came and told him that he had to stop. Hitchcock got so mad actually that he stormed off the set and threatened not to come back, and from that day forward, no union representatives were actually allowed on the set, which I don't believe is legal, but that's what happened. Also, if you recall this movie, if you've seen it, in the scene where Mrs. Blaney is murdered, there was actually another shot that was a close-up of her tongue, and it was dripping salivation, but upon the request of Universal Studios, they actually pulled that scene, and Hitchcock had to reluctantly agree to that and pull it himself, actually. So, some interesting, weird facts about this movie. Would you like to kick it off?
Didn't like it. Had never seen it. Didn't know what it was about. I should have known better. I told my parents, Kylie's grandparents, that we were going to watch it, and they both said we never cared for Frenzy. Kylie and I watched it, and I could see why. It was more violent, showed a little bit of nudity. Not sure why they even threw it in there. I did not see a lot about that movie that I liked. As far as the storyline, it just wasn't very interesting to me. I couldn't wait for it to get over, which I was surprised. I just didn't think it was that interesting, and when you told me that people thought like it was his biggest movie, really surprised me.
Yeah, there were several things that rubbed me the wrong way about this movie, especially a couple things. So for one thing, they glorified the tourism of death because this was a city that was being racked with terror because of this necktie murderer, and when this group of tourists is listening to this man talk in the first 5-10 minutes of the movie, they see this floating dead body in the water and everyone gets really excited. So that was weird, just glorifying death in that way. And that was actually the scene where Alfred Hitchcock had his cameo. He was one of the tourists in the crowd. And then there was the other scene, obviously, that was the rape and murder of Mrs. Blaney, and that was so disturbing to me, and I just had lost a lot of respect for Hitchcock when I watched that scene because he is obviously a male director, and that was back in the time when a lot of male figures in cinema went unchecked and they took advantage of females and stuff like that. So as someone who was very large in Hollywood at the time, he had to have known about a lot of that stuff going on, and the fact that he would show rape on scene anyways, I didn't understand. That is extremely triggering for women, but of course as a man he wouldn't be thinking about something like that when making a movie. And I feel bad for the actress that had to go through that scene as well. It had to have been really uncomfortable for the actors and stuff. This movie focused on the male point of view so heavily because even when Mrs. Blaney was being raped, there were several close-up shots of her breasts, which was very weird, and it just centered on the male gaze so much that it forced you to take the male perspective in this particular scene, which was the rapist. So why would we want to ever identify with the rapist? I don't know. Ugh. And it makes me mad because I know that there are men out there, gross little men out there somewhere, that will watch this movie and be turned on by such a scene. And so just the fact that it was ever made gets me a little bit heated. Didn't like this movie either. So I'm gonna stop talking about that.
I was seeing it as a man. I saw it as horrific, and I thought that the way he shot it, in all honesty, compared to movies that are incredibly graphic in today's world, I was more upset about that scene than most scenes that I've seen where they're trying to talk about a rape or something like that. And the fact that the way that he shot it, you knew that it was violence against a woman and all of that, but it was very disturbing. And I just appreciate the filmmaking part of it, that in 1972, to have me feel the way that I felt, which was horrified, and not having to do it like they do today in some of these movies that I've watched, including movies with you,
yes,
where it's something so horrifying that they're showing the actual act, and there's tons of nudity, and this was
more nuanced.
Nuance is a great word for it. Nuance.
Yeah, it was more nuanced.
Because this movie, the thing about it is, And if I would have known this, maybe I wouldn't even have wanted to see it. This movie is about a serial killer.
A serial rapist killer.
Yeah, it's not a very good topic.
No, it's not.
I don't know why people liked it so much. I don't get it.
I don't know. I don't know why this was considered his penultimate film. I feel like men who are very entitled and men who get off in similar circumstances, men that do not understand women, could potentially love this movie.
I mean, it's just the bottom line is Hitchcock or not. You know, there are just some movies, no matter whether the actor is somebody that you love, there may be a movie that you don't like. She doesn't like it, and Dora the cat. So
you want attention?
We don't have a lot of positive things to say about this movie. I'll be interested to see or hear comments that you all make who have seen it or who decide to at least check it out a little bit and see what you think about it. Because honestly, I don't get it.
I was just very uncomfortable the whole time, and
me too.
I think I was more so and was pointing out all this stuff more so because I am also a woman, and women were very much targeted in this movie, and this movie was heavily identifying with the men, and this is true of a lot of Hollywood movies, especially dating back then, but just not a fan. And I lost some respect for Hitchcock. I thought it was very, very weird. This whole movie just objectifying women, making fun of women. I didn't like it. That's the bottom line.
And we agree.
I don't have any further questions. I feel like I ranted so much. We both ranted so much about these movies. I do want to know which movie you prefer between Psycho and The Birds.
The Birds is still my favorite.
I think me too.
Along with Rear Window.
Rear Window is a great one.
If you haven't seen Rear Window, that's a great movie.
Yeah, I would have preferred to talk about Rear Window to Frenzy, but we wanted to talk about all horror related. I guess Frenzy was kind of more of a thriller, but I was horrified while watching it.
It's off the list now. We know that we don't ever want to see it again. It is not a rewatchable movie.
No. I think that's gonna do it though. We did last night watch The Woman in Black and The Woman in Black 2, Angel of Death, so I think we're gonna be reviewing those in a couple of days, so that video will probably be up next week, would be my guess. So stay tuned for that. Click the subscribe button if you haven't already. I post every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 5 o'clock p.m., but if you hit the notification bell, then you'll just be notified every single time that I post. I said that all in one breath.
Tired me out from that one. Until later, peace out.
Peace out.